The training facility was full of nervous cadets that morning, and Maya Brooks stood near the back of the line with her fingers touching the silver pendant under her uniform collar, and the biometric scanner had been checking people for 3 hours. Now, with its cold blue light washing over each face before making a sound for approval or denial, what the humans around her did not know was that Maya was not entirely human, and beneath the carefully maintained illusion there were pointed ears. Hidden by technology her people had perfected over many centuries, and her true name was Melis of the Starwood clans, and she was one of the last elven refugees that had fled to the outer colonies. Generations ago, when their homeworld fell to the collective, the dragon stirred in her mind, and his name was Raikor, and he was not a pet, but a bond brother who had chosen her when she was barely 16 years old, and he was coiled in the maintenance tunnels 3 levels below with his obsidian scales, making him nearly invisible in the shadows, and through their telepathic link she felt his restless anticipation. Something felt wrong to both of them as the line moved forward, and when the cadet in front of Maya stepped away after being cleared for standard access, she moved forward and placed her palm on the cool glass surface, and the blue light swept across her hand, and then her face, and then it froze completely. The silence stretched for 5 long heartbeats, and then the machine spoke in a voice that made every head in the room turn toward her, and it said, "Access level creator and identity confirmed and welcome back, architect." Melis' room erupted into chaos immediately, and security officers rushed forward with weapons drawn, and Maya's commanding officer, Captain Hayes, went pale, but Maya could not move or breathe because the words made no sense at all to her, and the creators were just myths, and they were ancient beings who had built the Jumpgate network that connected 1,000 human worlds, and they had vanished 20,000 years ago. She had never been to this facility before in her entire life. Captain Hayes demanded an explanation from her, with his voice sharp with suspicion and fear, but before Maya could respond, the alarms began shrieking throughout the entire complex, and Raikor's voice crashed through her mind like thunder, telling her that collective ships had just dropped out of hyperspace, and there were hundreds of them, and they had finally found them. Maya met the captain's eyes and let her illusion drop completely, and her ears lengthened to elegant points, and her eyes shifted to ancient gold, and luminescent marks flickered to life along her neck and arms with ancient script in a language older than human civilization. She told him quietly that she could explain everything, but they were out of time now, because that scanner had just activated every defense system the creators had left behind, and the collective knew it had happened through the walls. She could feel ancient mechanisms awakening and responding to her presence after sitting dormant for thousands of years, and in the tunnels below, Raikor spread his wings, and starlight seemed to dance along his scales. The war that had destroyed her people's world had finally found them here, and somehow Maya held the key to weapons that could change everything, if she could figure out why a scanner thought she was a god. The facility descended into controlled chaos while officers barked orders and cadets scrambled to battle stations, and Maya stood frozen in the scanning chamber with her mind reeling from what had just happened, and Captain Hayes had sealed the room, but through the transparent walls she watched humanity prepare for a war they did not understand at all. Raikor's voice resonated through their bond, telling her that he was reading massive energy buildups in sectors she had never accessed before, and the station was responding to her presence in ways neither of them could explain. She closed her eyes and reached out with senses her people had refined over countless generations, and the facility was not just a military training outpost at all, and beneath the human construction she felt something vast and sleeping, with networks of technology that sang in frequencies her pointed ears could perceive, and every corridor and every wall and every system hummed with recognition of her presence. Captain Hayes stood on the other side of the glass, with his expression torn between duty and desperation, and through the intercom his voice crackled, telling her they had 3 minutes before the collective vanguard entered firing range, and whatever she was and whatever this situation meant, he needed answers immediately. Maya pressed her palm against the glass and told him she did not have answers either, but she thought she could help them if he would let her try. A junior officer burst into the outer chamber, and it was Lieutenant Kara Moss, who had been Maya's bunkmate for the past 6 months, and she looked terrified as she reported that the defense grid was powering up on its own, and weapon systems they did not no existed were coming online, and engineering said they were receiving commands in a language their computers could not translate through the windows. The first collective warships appeared as burning stars against the black void, and their hulls bore the marks of the same empire that had reduced her homeworld to ash and killed most of her family. Maya told the captain to open the door and trust her, or they would all die here today for one heartbeat. Hayes hesitated, and then he slammed his fist against the release panel, and the door opened. Maya strode through the opening with her movements taking on a grace that her human disguise had always masked, and every step felt different now, as if the station itself recognized her footfalls. And the luminescent marks on her skin pulsed brighter as she realized they matched patterns etched into the walls that had been invisible beneath. Layers of human paint and paneling. She explained while walking that the creators had not vanished at all, but had transcended and left this dimension entirely. But before they went, they had planted seeds and failsafes, and her people, the Elven clans, were one of those seeds, and they were engineered inheritors with modified genetics designed to activate creator systems if certain conditions were met. Hayes asked what those conditions were while almost running to keep pace with Hershey. Answered simply that it was the return of the collective. They burst into the command center where screens displayed the approaching enemy fleet of 200 ships, and each one was capable of destroying a planet, and Admiral Kate Sullivan, who commanded the facility, turned from the displays with her silver hair pulled back tight. The Admiral demanded to know why her station seemed possessed by something. Maya did not answer with words, but instead walked to the central console and placed both hands on its surface. An ancient script flared to life, wrapping around her wrists like living light, and words came to her lips in a language she had never learned, but somehow knew. Through Rykor's eyes, she saw him emerge from the tunnels into a massive hangar that had not existed in any blueprints, and there were rows upon rows of ships that were sleek and deadly, with their hulls marked with the same script that now covered Maya's skin, and they had been waiting for 20,000 years. The computer announced that creator weapons were online, and Architect Command was recognized, and it was awaiting orders from her. Admiral Sullivan stared at Maya and then at the screens, showing impossible technology activating throughout the station, and asked what she really was. Maya's eyes glowed like molten gold as she answered that she was the key the creators had left behind, and the collective was about to remember why they had feared the creators so much. Rykor's roar echoed through the hangar as ancient fighters lifted into flight, with their systems responding to her bond brother as if he had always been their pilot. The first collective ship entered weapons range, and Maya smiled, but it was not entirely human anymore. She gave the command to fire. The void erupted in light and fury as weapons that had slept since before human civilization first looked to the stars tore through collective shields like they were made of paper, and the ancient defensive platforms Maya had awakened did not fire conventional munitions, but instead they bent space itself and created crushing singularities that swallowed enemy ships whole or fragmented them across dimensional boundaries. In the command center, Admiral Sullivan gripped her console with her knuckles white as she watched the impossible display of power. Maya interrupted her shock by saying this was not the work of any god, but just very old engineers with a talent for warfare. Through Rykor's eyes, she watched her bond brother lead a squadron of creator fighters into the collective formation, and the ships moved like living things as they responded to dragon thought as naturally as breathing, and his consciousness touched each vessel, and they danced through enemy fire in patterns no human pilot could ever achieve. His joy sang through their bond, because for the first time since fleeing their destroyed homeworld, he could fight without any restraint. Lieutenant Moss reported that they were getting signals from the collective flagship, and they were broadcasting in Old Elven and demanding to speak with the architect. Maya felt the weight of 1,000 eyes in the command center on her back, and Captain Hayes moved beside her with his earlier suspicion replaced by something harder to define. She told them to let the transmission through the main screen flickered and revealed a chamber of twisted metal and bio-organic technology, and the creature that appeared was neither fully organic nor mechanical, and its form was a nightmare fusion of both, and Maya recognized it immediately from the histories her mother had whispered before the end, and it was a collective overmind, which was one of the hive intelligence nodes that coordinated their endless expansion. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of millions asking why she defended these primitive humans. Maya stepped forward and let her full presence fill the screen, and behind her every surface in the command center glowed with ancient script. And she told the overmind that these primitives were under her protection, and it should remember what that meant. The overmind's optical sensors flickered with what might have been fear, and it said the creators were gone and her weapons could not stop the collective's full might, because they numbered in the millions of ships across 1,000 systems. Maya suggested softly that it should recall them all, because she was about to activate something their ancient programming still remembered. And she asked if they still dreamed of the cascade. The silence that followed was absolute, and even through the view screen, Maya could feel the terror radiating from the overmind, because the cascade had been a creator weapon that ended the first collective war by turning their own networked intelligence against them and fracturing their unity across light years. In an instant, the overmind said the cascade protocols were destroyed, but doubt crept through its unified voice. Maya smiled without any warmth and explained that the creators never destroyed anything but just hid it very well, and they had taught her people how to find it, and she was standing in the key nexus right now, and she told them to give the order to retreat, or she would activate every cascade node in this sector, and their ships would be fighting each other before they finished the jump home. In the hangar, Raykor positioned his fighter with the rest of the squadron to bracket the collective fleet, and through their bond, Maya felt his readiness to paint the stars with fire if she gave the word. Admiral Sullivan leaned close to Captain Hayes and whispered, asking if Maya was bluffing. Hayes whispered back that he did not think Maya herself knew the answer. To that, the overmind sensors swept across the command center and read energy signatures that confirmed the threat was real, and for a consciousness that had conquered star systems, the calculation was simple, because it meant certain victory against these humans or potential catastrophic cascade failure across their entire network. The overmind finally announced that the collective would withdraw, but it warned that they would study this encounter and adapt, because the creators were gone and she was alone. Maya replied that she was never alone, and she could feel Raykor's fierce agreement through their bond, and she added that the overmind had just reminded every sleeping system in this galaxy that the collective still threatened, and she wondered how many other primitive species would suddenly find creator gifts activating on their worlds. The transmission cut, and for 10 heartbeats nobody in the command center moved at all. Then the sensor officer shouted that the enemy was jumping and the entire fleet was entering hyperspace and retreating. A ragged cheer went up across the command center, but Maya felt no celebration, because she had bought them time and nothing more, and the collective would return adapted and prepared. And she had just revealed herself to humanity as something other and something ancient and dangerous. Admiral Sullivan approached with her expression unreadable and ordered Maya to stand down the creator systems, because they needed to talk. Maya nodded wearily and felt the vast networks respond to her will by powering down but not sleeping, because they would never sleep. Again in the hangar, Raykor landed the creator fighter and shifted back to his natural form, with his scales drinking in the ancient technology's light, and through their bond, she felt his question about what would happen now. Maya looked at the humans surrounding her, and at the station that had revealed itself as so much more than anyone knew, and at the stars, where an enemy had retreated but would inevitably return. She whispered that now they would prepare for the real war. 3 days after the collective's retreat, Maya found herself in a conference room that had not existed before the biometric scanner had recognized her, and the walls were composed of the same ancient material as the creator systems, and they were translucent and faintly luminous, with inscribed flowing script that shifted and moved like living water. Across the table sat the highest-ranking officers of the Sol Defense Fleet, and Admiral Sullivan presided over them, flanked by generals and intelligence directors and representatives from a dozen colony worlds, and they had been questioning Maya for hours, and their fear was a palpable thing in the air. General Martin Cole asked her to clarify that this entire station, which they had occupied for 15 years, had been a dormant creator facility the whole time. Maya corrected him by saying it was not dormant but waiting, because the Creators had seeded hundreds of installations across the galaxy, and they were activated by specific genetic triggers when certain threat parameters were met. Director Lisa Park from Intelligence said with a sharp tone that Maya just happened to have those genetics, and how convenient that was. Captain Hayes, who had been granted special clearance to attend, spoke up in her defense, saying that they would all be dead without her, and the collective fleet would have torn through their defenses in minutes. Admiral Sullivan interrupted by asking what else Maya was not telling them and what other surprises were waiting in their own installations. Before Maya could answer, the door opened without anyone touching it, and Rykor strode in with his human form, being a careful illusion that fooled no one in this room because they all knew what he was now. He moved to stand behind Maya's chair, and his presence was a silent declaration of unity, and through their bond, she felt his simmering anger at how they were treating her. Maya said quietly that they should stop treating her like a threat and start listening, because the creators did not just build weapons but built a network of refuges and training grounds and knowledge repositories, and this station was one of them, and there were others hidden on worlds across human space, with some in their military installations and some buried under their oldest colonies. The room erupted in overlapping questions and protests until Maya raised her hand and the walls flared bright, which silenced them all with the casual display of power. She continued by explaining that the collective had destroyed her homeworld when she was a child, and they wiped out 90% of her people in a single day, and the survivors scattered across the galaxy by hiding among other species and waiting. And her mother had told her stories about the creators and about how they had engineered several species as potential inheritors, and humans were one and her people were another, and the collective was supposed to be a third before they went rogue. Director Park leaned forward and asked if she was saying the collective were creator-made. Turikor spoke for the first time, with his voice carrying harmonics that made several officers wince, and he explained they were a failed experiment in networked intelligence because the creators tried to give them free will within unity, but instead created an entity that views all non-networked life as inferior and as resources. Maya nodded and added that the creators tried to stop them, and the war lasted 1,000 years and ended in stalemate, and that was when the creators decided to transcend and leave this dimension entirely, but they left behind tools and weapons and guardians, and her people were meant to activate these systems if the collective ever threatened to dominate the galaxy. Admiral Sullivan was quiet for a long moment before saying that now the collective knew Maya existed and they would come back prepared. Maya agreed and said they would come back adapted, but so would humanity, because the systems she had awakened contained detailed schematics for technology their scientists would take decades to fully understand, including weapons and ships and defensive platforms, and more importantly, they contained strategic data on the collective structure and their hive network protocols and their weaknesses. She stood and placed her hands flat on the table, and the surface lit up by projecting a three-dimensional map of the galaxy and red markers scattered across it like a plague. She explained that red markers were confirmed collective territories and yellow markers were worlds they were assimilating, and then green markers appeared by the dozens, and she said these were other creator facilities, with most being inactive and waiting for the right genetic triggers, and some had already awakened. General Cole studied the map and asked how many other architects were out there. Maya admitted she did not know, because the creator protocols were designed with redundancy, using multiple trigger species and multiple activation conditions, and she might be the first, or she might be the 100th, but now that the systems were active, others would begin to appear. Director Park asked about the dragons and if there were more of them. Turikor smiled with all his teeth showing and said dragons had always been here, but they simply chose not to be seen, and the creators valued them as bond partners for the architects because they could see across dimensional boundaries that even the creators could not perceive, and they were not weapons but witnesses and guardians. Lieutenant Karamos, who had been granted clearance as Maya's former bunkmate, spoke up hesitantly from her corner seat and asked what Maya needed from them. Maya met her friend's eyes gratefully and answered that she needed trust and access and time, because the creator systems would only fully respond to designated architects, but they could share some capabilities with approved users, and she could train people to interface with the technology, but it required genetic compatibility, testing, and some humans would be able to use it, but most would not. Admiral Sullivan said slowly that Maya was talking about building a new military division, built around creator technology and led by non-humans. Maya corrected her by saying she was talking about survival because the collective would not wait, and they were regrouping right now and analyzing what happened and developing countermeasures. And they had maybe 6 months before the collective returned in force, and 6 months to activate as many facilities as possible and train as many people as they could and prepare for a war that would decide whether organic life remained free. In this galaxy, the room fell silent as everyone processed her words. Admiral Sullivan stood with her decision crystallizing in her eyes, and she began giving orders to reprioritize military projects and start genetic screening and promote Captain Hayes to Colonel as liaison to the architect program. She fixed Maya with a look that was equal parts command and plea, and told her they were trusting her with the survival of their species, and asked her not to make them regret it. Maya felt the weight settle on her shoulders and said she would need access to astronomical databases and permission to contact other elven refuges, and Rykor would need to recruit other dragons. Sullivan granted it all without hesitation and welcomed her to the war. As the meeting ended and officers filed out with urgency, Maya remained at the table staring at the galaxy map with its red and yellow and green lights painting the darkness. Rykor placed a hand on her shoulder and asked if she was scared. She admitted she was terrified and asked, what if she was not enough, and what if the creators were wrong about them? He said simply that then they would die trying, but they would die free, and sometimes that was victory enough. Through the windows a new light appeared as another creator facility responded to her awakening and declared itself to the galaxy after thousands of years of silence. The war had begun, and Maya, who had only wanted to serve quietly and hide what she was now, stood at its center. 5 months passed in a blur of activation sequences and desperate preparation, and Maya stood on the observation deck of the renamed station, watching ships of her own design launch into space. And they were not purely creator technology, because humanity had added their own innovations by creating hybrid vessels that married ancient power with modern tactics. Colonel Hayes joined her at the viewport, looking older now and marked by the weight of knowledge, and he reported that 17 more facilities had awakened, and they had identified 12 other architects, with 8 being elven like her and 3 being human with dormant creator genetics, and 1 being something they were still trying to figure out. Maya smiled faintly and asked if the dragon recruitment succeeded. Hayes told her that Rykor had convinced 37 dragons to join them, and they were bonding with the new architects now, but they had problems because the collective had not been idle. The tactical display showed disturbing intelligence because the collective had been raiding isolated creator facilities and overwhelming them before full activation, and worse, they had begun developing technology specifically designed to disrupt the ancient systems, and they were adapting faster than anticipated. Maya asked how long until they attacked here, though she already knew the answer. Hayes said days or maybe a week, because their scouts reported a fleet 3 times the size of their first attempt massing at the sector boundary, and they were not ready. Maya said they would never be ready because the creators fought the collective for 1,000 years and could not win, and they were just hoping to survive. A presence touched her mind, and it was not Rykor, because he was in the training halls with younger dragons, and this was something else that felt vast and cold and ancient. And Maya's hands flew to the console as she pulled up sensor readings. Hayes demanded to know what it was. She said something was coming through hyperspace and something big, and the energy signature was impossible because it was older than the station itself. The viewport filled with light as reality tore open, and a vessel emerged that was bigger than even the largest human battleships, and its hull was composed of the same translucent material as the creator stations, but this was not dormant because this was alive and pulsing with power that made the sensors scream. A communication channel opened, and the voice that emerged was the same artificial tone that had first recognized Maya at the biometric scanner. It announced that architect designation was confirmed and fleet command protocols were initiated, and this was the original creator expeditionary fleet returning from dimensional exile. Maya's breath stopped as she said that was impossible because the creators left this dimension permanently. The voice replied negative and explained that primary consciousness transcended, but the military expeditionary force remained in adjacent dimensional space, and they were awaiting specific trigger conditions, and the condition was met because the Architect network reactivated and collective threat was confirmed at terminal escalation levels, and the fleet was emerging to provide support. Behind the first ship, space continued to tear open and dozens of vessels appeared, and then hundreds, and each one bore the unmistakable mark of creator origin, but these were not dormant installations, but warships kept in fighting trim across 20,000 years of dimensional exile. The command center exploded with activity, and Admiral Sullivan's voice crackled over communications, asking Maya to please tell her those were friendly. Maya was laughing with tears streaming down her face as she said they were not just friendly, but they were the cavalry. Rykor burst through the door with his eyes wide, telling her he felt them arrive, and those ships had dragons aboard them, and ancient ones, and they were calling to the younger dragons. The creator fleet moved into formation around the station with the precision of forces that had drilled together for thousands of years, and their weapons lit up Maya's console like stars. A voice introduced itself as Fleet Marshal Varden, who was last of the Creator Warmind chorus, and said they did not require command authority because her activation was sufficient to bring them home, but they offered their strength to her defense. Maya straightened and asked if they would stand with humanity and the free peoples of this galaxy against the collective threat. Varden replied that they left this dimension to spare everyone their war, but she had called them back, and they honored the bonds forged with her ancestors, and where she stood they would stand. An alarm blared because the collective fleet had arrived early by dropping out of hyperspace at the system's edge, and the 300 ships that intelligence predicted were joined by 200 more with their hulls modified with technology designed to counter creator systems. Admiral Sullivan ordered all ships to battle stations and welcomed Marshal Varden to the war and hoped they remembered how to fight. Varden's response carried what might have been humor, saying they were the ones who taught the universe what war meant, and they had not forgotten. Maya closed her eyes and reached out through the network of awakened stations and felt the presence of every architect across human space, and they had trained for this moment, though most of them were barely more than children like her, and thrust into a role they did not understand. But they were not alone anymore, she broadcast to all stations, saying the collective was here, but so were they, and so were the creators, and so were the dragons, and every free soul in this galaxy who refused to kneel, and she told them to remind the enemy why they retreated last time. Rykor shifted, and his human form fell away as scales erupted across his body, and he was beautiful and terrible as a being of star-born majesty. He said simply that he was with her to the end. Through the viewport, the two fleets accelerated toward each other, and creator ships of ancient design flew alongside human vessels, and dragon-bonded architects coordinated across impossible distances, and the collective came as a tide of networked malice, but they came against a storm they could not predict. Maya placed her hand on the console and felt every system respond, and she was no longer just a cadet hiding what she was, but the key the creators had left behind, and the bridge between ancient power and new hope, the war that had destroyed her homeworld and driven the creators from reality itself had found its next battlefield. And this time, as the first weapons fired and space became a canvas of destruction and defiance, they were ready. The scanner had called her creator, and perhaps not in the literal sense, but in the way that mattered most, because she would help create humanity's future or die, defending their right to have one. As Rykor roared and dove into battle, and as Marshal Varden's fleet unleashed weapons that bent physics itself, and as Admiral Sullivan's forces fought with desperate courage, Maya smiled. Let the collective come with their millions of ships and their networked intelligence. They would learn what the creators had always known, that free will held a power no network could match: the power to choose, and the power to hope, and the power to fight even when victory seemed impossible. The battle raged on, and Maya fought at its heart, no longer hiding, and no longer afraid, but just an elf and a dragon, and the ancient legacy of beings who dared to dream that freedom was worth any price.